In the fall of 1991, on a stretch of Crack County blacktop outside of Kinsley in Edwards County, Kansas, a 41-year-old woman named Hazel Drummond spent $847 on 14 second-hand beehives, a used extractor that smelled like someone else's honey, and a hand-painted sign that she nailed to a fence post at the end of her driveway. The sign said, "Drummond Honey, EST, 1991. She had painted it herself with leftover barn paint, and the letters were not perfectly straight. And her neighbor, Vic Quarles, who ran a feed operation on the adjacent property, slowed his truck when he drove past and looked at it for a long moment before driving on without stopping. That was the beginning. Hazel had not planned to become a beekeeper. She had not planned most of what had happened to her in the previous 2 years, and bees were one item in a long list of things she had arrived at, by necessity rather than by choice. Her husband, Dennis Drummond, had died in August of 1989, a Wednesday, of a ruptured aneurysm while he was patching a section of the south fence. He was 44 years old. Hazel had found him at 4 in the afternoon when she drove out to bring him water. She sat with him for 11 minutes before the ambulance came from Lewis, because she did not think a man should lie in a field alone in the August heat. The Drummond place was 320 acres, half in dryland wheat and half in native grass pasture. Dennis had managed it the way his father had managed it, and the way his father's father had managed it, which is to say carefully, and without drama, and with an intimate knowledge of every low spot and drainage ditch on the property. Hazel had grown up on a wheat farm 20 miles east and understood land, but the bees a dry July, but the bees were not Dennis's idea. The bees were her own. She had started reading about them in the winter of 1990, sitting at the kitchen table after the work was done, going through a stack of back issues from a beekeeping journal she had mail-ordered from a supplier in Missouri. What she was reading was not complicated, but it was layered. And the more she read, the more she understood that most people who thought about bees thought about honey. What interested Hazel was something different. She had been watching her wheat fields lose yield for 3 years, slow incremental losses that Dennis had attributed to weather and soil and the general difficulty of farming dryland in western Kansas. What the beekeeping journal kept returning to, in issue after issue, was pollination. Not of wheat, wheat doesn't need bees, but of the native plants along the margins, the wildflowers in the draws, the clover patches her neighbor Vic Quarles cursed as weeds. The bees, the journal argued, were not a product, they were an index. Where bees thrived, the land beneath them was telling you something about itself. Hazel had written a letter to a woman named Dolores Fanning in Pratt County, Kansas, who had been keeping bees for 30 years, and who had written one of the articles in the journal. Dolores wrote back 3 weeks later, 4 pages in a small looping hand on yellow legal paper, and the 2 women had been corresponding by mail ever since. They were not friends exactly, not the kind of friends who knew each other's faces, but they were the kind of friends who knew each other's land. She had also ordered a book from a university extension office in Manhattan, Kansas. It was a 200-page technical manual on native prairie ecology, and it was not written for people like Hazel, but she read it twice and made notes in the margins the way her father had taught her to read anything she meant to understand rather than just finish. What she was beginning to see, reading between the lines of the manual and the journal and Dolores Fanning's yellow legal paper letters, was a picture of her property she had never quite had before. The clover that Vic Quarles called weeds, the milkweed along the fence lines, the patches of switchgrass in the lower pasture that Dennis had never broken up, because the ground was too soft and the equipment would sink. These were not failures of management, they were infrastructure. They were the machinery of something she didn't have a word for yet. She bought the 14 hives in October of 1991 and placed them along the south fence line, tucked against a row of Osage orange trees that had been there since before her father-in-law was born. She also stopped mowing the margins of her wheat fields. She left a 12-foot border on all four sides of both fields, unmowed, unsprayed, and undisturbed. She stopped using herbicide on the clover in the draw at the east end of the property. She let the milkweed grow along County Road 7, where her fence line ran. This is where the story in Edwards County began. The story did not travel as fast in Edwards County as it might have in a larger place. But Edwards County is not a large place, and what stories it has it keeps well. The feed store in Kinsley was where most of them started, and this one started there in the spring of 1992, when a man named Otis Bergfeld, who delivered seed to half the farms in the county. But it was a dry, mentioned to the man at the counter that he had driven past the Drummond place and noticed that Hazel had not mowed her field margins. This would not be remarkable in most contexts. In Edwards County, where dryland wheat farmers maintained their margins with a thoroughness that was almost competitive, it was remarkable. Unmowed margins meant weeds. Weeds meant seeds blowing into the neighbors' fields. It meant a certain kind of carelessness that people in farm country associated with operations that were struggling, or with owners who had given up. Nobody thought Hazel had given up, but they thought something had happened to her. Winifred Pryor, who ran the diner on Main Street with her husband and who had known Hazel since they were both in the 4-H together 30 years earlier, told her husband that she thought Hazel was having a hard time with the grief. Men grieved differently, Winifred said. But women who had been farming women sometimes turned it outward, started doing things that didn't make obvious sense. Let things go that they would have kept up if they were all right. Her husband, who had farmed before his knees gave out, said he'd driven past and counted 14 beehives along the south fence, and he didn't know what that was about, but it wasn't what he'd do with 320 acres in Edwards County. Winifred said she'd try to get out to visit. She didn't get out that spring. Vic Quarles, who had watched Hazel nail up the sign in 1991 and had said nothing, stopped his truck in April of 1992 at the section corner where their properties met and looked at her unmowed margins for several minutes. He could see the hives from there, a row of white boxes against the dark line of the Osage orange. He had been farming this county for 38 years, and he had run a clean operation, and he did not believe in leaving field margins for weeds. He drove home without stopping at Hazel's door because Hazel Drummond was not the kind of woman you told what to do with her own property. But he watched. The whole county was watching by summer. What the county could not see from the road, what even Vic Quarles, with his 38 years of farming instinct, could not see from the section corner, was what was happening in those unmowed margins. Hazel was walking them every week, the way her father had taught her to walk any piece of ground she wanted to understand. Slowly, looking down, stopping when something changed beneath her feet. She had a spiral. She had a spiral notebook, a cheap one from the drugstore in Kinsley, in which she recorded what she found. Which plants were coming up, where the bees were foraging, what she saw in the soil when she knelt down and looked. She was not a scientist. She knew this, but she had grown up watching her father read a field the way some people read a newspaper. Quickly, with complete comprehension and an instinct for what mattered. She was trying to do the same thing. She was looking at her margins the way her father had looked at a field, with the understanding that everything visible on the surface was a message about what was happening underneath. What she was beginning to find, carefully, without telling anyone, was that her margins were changing. The clover in the draw was spreading. The milkweed had come back dense along the fence line where she had stopped spraying. The switchgrass in the lower pasture, which had always been thin and patchy, was filling in. She found plants in her margins that she could not name, and she pressed them between sheets of wax paper and sent them to Dolores Fanning in Pratt County, who knew her plants the way some people know their family, and Dolores wrote back with names: wild bergamot, prairie blazing star, partridge pea. Plants that had been there before the county was broken for wheat, plants that had retreated to the ditches and the fence lines and the corners of fields where the equipment couldn't reach. Plants that were coming back now that she had stopped fighting them. The bees were doing what bees do, which is to go where the flowers are. And there were more flowers on the Drummond place than there had been in 20 years. And the bees were fat with it. She pulled her first harvest in August of 1992, 42 pounds of honey from 14 hives, and the color of it was dark amber, almost brown, and it tasted like something she didn't have a word for, but that Dolores Fanning, when Hazel mailed her a jar, described in a letter as prairie honey. The real kind. She sold it at the farmer's market in Kinsley at $4 a pound and sold out in 2 Saturdays. She did not mention this at the diner. The phone calls started that winter. Not many, 2 or 3, but they were long, specific calls with a woman in Colorado named Agnes Roark, who had been keeping bees and managing native margins for 15 years, and who had more data than Hazel had ever seen in one place. Agnes sent her photocopied articles from range ecology journals and a hand-drawn map of her own property, showing which margins had recovered fastest and why. Hazel pinned the map to the wall of the old milking parlor she used as a storage shed and stood in front of it for a long time on a January evening when the wind was doing what Kansas wind does in January, which is to come through every gap in the walls without apology. She was also talking to a man named Conrad Heiss at the Kansas State University Extension Office in Garden City, who had been studying native plant recovery on agricultural margins and who had heard about her from Dolores Fanning. Conrad was 40 years old and had spent his career trying to get farmers to do exactly what Hazel was doing, with limited success. He drove out to the Drummond place in February of 1993, on a Thursday, and Hazel walked him through the margins in the cold, stopping at each section to show him what she had noted in the notebook. He crouched in the dead winter grass and looked in the dead winter grass and looked at the root crowns of the plants coming up, and he was quiet for a long time before he said anything. "You've got something real here," he told her. "I want to come back in June." She said yes. She did not tell Vic Quarles. By the spring of 1993, the story in Edwards County had settled into its familiar shape. Hazel Drummond, widow, wheat farmer, had decided to let her field margins go to weeds and keep bees along the south fence. It was said with a kind of resigned affection, the way a small community talks about one of its own who has gone a little sideways. Nobody thought she was foolish exactly. They thought she was managing her grief in an unusual direction. The margins were an eyesore, the beehives were peculiar, and those long telephone calls she made in the evenings, which were nobody's business, but which a party line shares whether or not you want it to, were apparently about things like soil biology and native plant corridors, and something called pollinator habitat, which was not a phrase that meant much to people who had been farming Edwards County for 40 years. Not. Winifred Pryor finally drove out to visit in April of 1993, ostensibly to bring a casserole that was 2 years late, and she found Hazel in the east draw, kneeling in the dirt, looking at something through a handheld magnifying lens that she had ordered from a scientific supply catalog. Winifred stood at the edge of the field for a moment watching her. Hazel looked up. "Come look at this," Hazel said. Winifred walked across the draw, which was not easy in the shoes she was wearing, and crouched next to Hazel, and Hazel showed her the lens and pointed it at a cluster of small brown beetles moving through the base of a clover plant. But it was a dry. Winifred looked through the lens and then looked up at Hazel with an expression that she would later describe to her husband as difficult to categorize. "What am I looking at?" Winifred asked. "Soil predators," Hazel said. "They eat the things that eat the roots." Winifred looked through the lens again. She stayed for an hour and ate the casserole herself because she had forgotten it was in the truck. When she drove home, she told her husband that Hazel was fine and that she had been wrong about the grief. She also said that she thought something might be happening out there, though she could not have said exactly what. The summer of 1993 was dry. Western Kansas has a particular relationship with dry summers, which is the relationship of an old argument that never gets fully resolved. And Edwards County had lost more than one family's worth of hope to a string of dry Julies. This one was not a disaster, not 1988, not anything that would make the history books, but it was the kind of dry that shows you things, the kind of dry that separates land that has been managed with patience from land that has been managed with habit. By the third week of July, the wheat fields across Edwards County were harvested and empty, and the pastures were browning, and the ditches were dry, and the native grass in the road margins was brittle enough to crackle when the wind moved it. Hazel's wheat fields were harvested like everyone else's, and she was not going to claim otherwise. She had not done anything to her wheat fields that would make them different in a dry July. But her margins were different. The unmowed border around her east field, which had been building organic matter and root mass for 2 years, was holding moisture at the surface in a way she could measure with her hand. She pressed her palm flat on the soil in her margin on a morning in mid-July when the pasture across the road was visibly cracking, and the soil under her hand was not wet, but it was not the concrete hardness she felt across the fence line. Her bees were still working. The clover in the draw was still green at the base, dormant at the tips, but alive at the root crown in a way that the mowed margin on Vic Quarles's side of the property line was not. Conrad Heiss drove out in late July with a graduate student and a set of soil probes. He spent 2 Hazel's property and half a day on the neighboring sections, measuring soil temperature, moisture retention, and what he called biological activity. A phrase that covered a range of things he explained to Hazel carefully over 2 evenings at her kitchen table. What he found he did not share immediately, because he was a careful man and a careful scientist, and he did not share results he hadn't had time to think about. He called in September from Garden City. His voice was measured in the way people get measured when they are trying not to front-run their own conclusions. He told her that her managed margins were retaining measurably more soil moisture than the comparable sections on neighboring properties. He told her that the biological activity in her soil, earthworm counts, microbial density, root mass per square foot, was significantly higher in her marginal zones than in her managed fields, and dramatically higher than in the neighboring fence lines. He told her that he had found 9 native plant species in her draw margins that he had not found anywhere else in a 5-mile radius. There was a pause. She asked him what he thought it meant for the long term. He said, "I think your margins are acting as refugia. You're providing habitat for organisms that are rebuilding soil function across your whole property, not just the margins. The bees are part of it, but they're more like the indicator than the cause. You did the right things in the right order." Hazel wrote it down. She put the notebook in the filing cabinet next to Dennis's tractor maintenance logs, which she had kept because she could not bring herself to throw away anything written in his hand. She did not call Winifred Pryor that evening. She went out to the south fence and checked the hives in the dark, running her hand along the boxes the way she had done every night since 1991. The bees inside made the sound they make in late summer when the colony is full and settled, a low, continuous hum that you could feel through your palm if you pressed it flat against the wood. She stood there for a while. She had been 2 years waiting for someone with instruments to confirm what her knees and her magnifying lens had been telling her every morning in the draw. The confirmation was real, not hotted, but she was her father's daughter, and her father had believed that a thing worth saying was worth saying only once you were certain it would hold. She was not certain yet, but she was close. The winter of 1993 was not as hard as the previous one, but it was long, and the wind in January was the kind that makes a person question the decisions that led them to be in western Kansas at all. In February, the Edwards County Farm Bureau held its annual winter meeting at the Extension Hall in Kinsley. 44 people attended. The agenda included crop price projections, an update on the Federal Conservation Reserve Program, a discussion about the proposed expansion of a feedlot operation near the county line, and a presentation from the Extension Office about drought-resistant wheat varieties. Hazel attended, as she had every year since Dennis died. She sat near the middle. She did not speak. She had a notebook. Near the end of the meeting, a farmer named Glendon Sapp, who ran a large wheat and sorghum operation on the north end of the county, mentioned that he had seen some materials from the Kansas State Extension Office about something called conservation agriculture and pollinator habitat, and that he wasn't sure what to make of it. He had the pamphlet. He held it up. He said he'd be curious if anyone in the room had experience with it. There was a short silence. That's what Hazel's been doing. Vic Quarles said it from 2 rows back. He said it flatly, without emphasis, as a statement of information. Then, he turned and looked at her. 30 heads turned. Hazel looked at Vic Quarles. She looked at Glendon Sapp. She looked at the pamphlet in Glendon's hand, which was from Conrad Heiss's department, and which quoted figures she recognized because she had been supplying the data behind some of them for 2 years. "How long?" Glendon asked. "Since October of 1991, Hazel said. 2.5 years. The room did the thing rooms do when something that has been peripheral becomes central. Not loud, not dramatic. A certain shift in posture, a reorientation of attention. The kind of movement you feel more than you see." "Well," Glendon said, "I think we'd like to hear about it." What happened over the following months in Edwards County was not a conversion story, and it was not a triumph, and it was not the kind of thing that gets told dramatically, because it did not happen dramatically. It happened the way things happen in farming communities, incrementally, person by person, in kitchen conversations and fence line exchanges and phone calls that ran long into the evening. Glendon Sapp drove out in March. He was a large, deliberate man who had been farming for 40 years and who had a tendency to stand with his arms crossed and his chin down when he was thinking about something seriously. He walked Hazel's east draw with her for 2 hours, and she showed him the recovery in the native plants and let him push his hand into the soil and feel what she felt. He asked about cost, about time, about what she had given up in yield at the field margins. She was honest with him. She had lost some yield at the edges, she said. She had gained it back in other ways. She showed him the honey numbers for 2 years and the numbers Conrad Heiss had given her, and left him to make of them what he would. He drove home and did not order anything immediately, but he called Conrad Heiss in Garden City 2 days later and talked to him for 40 minutes. Vic Quarles came by in April on a Tuesday morning without calling first. Hazel was in the south margin, doing her weekly walk, notebook in hand, and she heard his truck and saw him park at the end of the driveway and sit for a minute before he got out. He walked down to where she was and stood next to her, and they both looked at the margin without speaking for a moment. "I've been driving past this place for 2.5 years," he said finally. She waited. "I said to my wife in the spring of '92 that you'd have that margin in weeds inside of a season, and then you'd mow it and we'd never hear about it again." He paused. "I said that more than once." "I know," she said. "I've been watching it," he said. "Something's different over here, and I can't tell you exactly what. But the ground looks different from the road. It looks like it's got more to it, somehow." She showed him the spiral notebook. She showed him Conrad's numbers. She showed him the 9 native species Conrad had cataloged in the draw. Vic was 61 years old and had been farming this county since he was 23, and he was not a man who made quick conclusions about land. He stood in the draw for a long time, looking at the base of the plants coming up through the dry winter residue. "I've got a low draw on the east side of my property," he said. "Been trying to drain it for 15 years. Never made much progress." She looked at him. "What would you do with it?" he asked. She told him. He ordered a consultation with Conrad Heiss in May. He did not install anything immediately. He came back to the Drummond place twice more before he started. Hazel answered every question and did not once say anything that could be interpreted as "told you so." Vic noticed this, but did not remark on it. Winifred Pryor came back in the spring too, this time without a casserole and in boots appropriate to the terrain. She brought her husband, who walked slowly because of his knees, but who stopped at every plant. Hazel pointed out and looked at it carefully, the way a man looks at something he is trying to decide whether he believes. At the draw, he pushed his heel into the soil, and then pushed it into the soil on the other side of the fence line on the road margin, and stood there, feeling the difference. "It's like 2 different countries," he said. "Same county," Hazel said. "Same county." He pushed his heel into the road margin again. "My grandfather farmed this road," he said. "He thought the ground was just what it was." "Most people did," Hazel said. He looked at the draw for a while. Then he took his hat off and looked at it. "What made you start?" he asked. "The bees," she said. "Or rather, what I started reading about the bees, what they were telling me about the land." He put his hat back on. "We always called this kind of ground worthless," he said, "the draws and the low spots." "Fence-line weeds," she nodded. He looked at the draw again. "Doesn't look worthless," he said. "It's not," she said. "The summer of 1994 was the test, or one of the tests, because the land tests you every year in western Kansas, and it is only over years that the score accumulates. The summer of 1994 was drier than 1993, not catastrophic July, not catastrophically dry, not 1988, but dry in the way that removed any doubt about where the moisture was and where it wasn't. By late July, the draws on most properties in Edwards County were baked and cracked, and the native grass in the road ditches was the color of old straw. The wheat was in, and the pastures that had cattle on them were showing the kind of wear that dry July brings. On the Drummond place, the east draw was green. Not lush, not impossibly green, not a miracle. Dormant at the top, alive at the base, with a root mass that had been building for 3 years, and was now pulling moisture from 2 feet down. The bees were working the bergamot that bloomed in the draw, the last flowers in the county blooming late in a dry summer because their root systems went deep enough to find water the surface plants couldn't reach. Hazel's honey harvest that August was 68 pounds from 16 hives. She had added 2 hives in the spring. She sold it at the farmer's market in Kinsley and at a shop in Greensburg that had started carrying local food products, and she charged $5 a pound, because Dolores Fanning in Pratt County had told her that good honey could command a price, and that underpricing it was a form of inaccuracy. Conrad Heiss came back in August with 2 graduate students and a more thorough measurement protocol. He spent a week on Hazel's property. He spent 2 days on neighboring sections. He took photographs. He made soil cores. He counted insects. He called in October. It was a dry. His voice this time was less careful, the way a scientist's voice changes when the data has passed the threshold of doubt. He told her that her managed margins now showed a 31% higher soil organic matter content than the comparable unmanaged sections on neighboring properties. He told her that earthworm density was 4 times higher in her marginal zones. He told her that the native plant species count in her draw had risen to 14 in 3 years, and that several of those species had not been recorded in Edwards County in over 40 years. There was a silence. "Are those numbers right?" Hazel asked. Conrad said they were. She thanked him, and wrote the numbers in the spiral notebook and filed it with the others, which now occupied most of the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. She went out and sat on the back step in the October evening and watched the last light go off the Osage orange trees along the south fence. The hives were quiet, the way hives get quiet in October when the colony is contracting for winter. She had been 3 years building, something she could not show anyone from the road. The numbers were real. The ground was real. Conrad was going to write it up, he had said so. And she had told him yes, she would be named. She had thought about it and decided that the thing to be private about was the doubt, not the work. In March of 1995, the Edwards County Farm Bureau held its annual meeting. 51 people attended, 7 more than had come the previous year. The agenda included the usual items and a new item at the end, added at the request of Glendon Sapp and seconded by Vic Quarles. A presentation on native margin management and pollinator habitat by Hazel Drummond. She had not prepared remarks. She had the spiral notebooks, 4 of them now, carried in a paper grocery bag. She had Conrad Heiss's preliminary report, 11 pages, stapled. She had a hand-drawn map of her property, showing the margins and the hive placement and the species recovery in each zone, drawn on butcher paper in pencil and colored pencil, the colors corresponding to plant communities. She unrolled the map on the table at the front of the room and stood beside it and talked about it the way she had always talked about land, which was plainly and with specificity and without ornamentation. She told them what her margins had looked like in 1991. She told them about the Beekeeping Journal and Dolores Fanning and Conrad Heiss and Agnes Rourke in Colorado. She told them about the soil probes and the earthworm counts and the 14 native species and what that meant for moisture retention in a dry July. She told them about the honey, the harvest numbers for the prices she had gotten, the fact that 2 of the species she was growing in the draw were medicinal plants with commercial value she hadn't initially considered. She told them about 1994 and what the dry July had shown. Glendon Sapp asked the first question. Vic Quarles asked the second. Winifred Pryor's husband, who had driven himself despite the knees because his wife had told him this was worth it, did not ask a question. He nodded once. Slowly, the way a man nods when he is recalculating something. The questions ran for more than an hour. Hazel answered all of them. She said, "I don't know," 4 times. Each time about something specific, and each time she wrote down the question and the name of the person to whom she would send a referral. She referred to Conrad Heiss. She referred to Agnes Roark. She referred to Dolores Fanning. She referred to Dolores Fanning, who had not driven up from Pratt County, but who had sent a letter that Hazel read aloud near the end. 4 paragraphs in a small looping hand that described what 30 years of margin management had done for the land Dolores had been watching since she was young. Near the end, Otis Bergfeld, the seed deliveryman who had been the first person to notice that Hazel's margins were unmowed in the spring of 1992 and who had mentioned it at the feed store, raised his hand from the back of the room. "Hazel," he said, "I want to ask you something." He paused. "When you started in 91 and people were driving past and shaking their heads, and I know I was one of them, did you ever think maybe they were right?" The room was quiet. Hazel looked at Otis Bergfeld for a long moment. "Every single week," she said. "That's why I kept the notebook." The room was quiet in a particular way, the way that happens when something true has been said plainly, and there is nothing to add to it. By 1997, 6 properties in Edwards County had established native margin programs. Not all of them were doing it the way Hazel had done it. Not all of them were getting the same results. The results required patience and observation, and a willingness to learn from the land rather than impose on it, and not everyone had that in equal measure. But 6 properties were trying. Glendon Sapp converted his east draw in 1995. By the second year, he was seeing plant recovery that surprised him. Species he said he hadn't seen since he was a boy, helping his father cut hay in that exact draw. He called Hazel in the evening sometimes, and the conversations were long and specific, and had a quality of excitement beneath the flatness that is a particular feature of farmers who have discovered something they didn't expect. Vic Quarles took the low draw on his east side and stopped trying to drain it. He planted it with seed mix Conrad Heiss had recommended and let it find itself, which took 2 seasons. By 1997, the draw that had frustrated him for 15 years was the wettest corner of his property in a dry summer, and he had 8 beehives along the Osage-orange fence he shared with Hazel, and the honey from them was darker than any he had bought in a store. He brought Hazel a jar of it in October of 1997. He came to the door and handed it to her and stood on the porch with his cap in his hands. "I used to tell Louise I couldn't figure out what you thought you were doing out here," he said. She waited. "I can figure it out now," he said. "Come in," she said. "I'll show you what Conrad found in the soil cores this year." Conrad Heiss published his full paper in 1996 in a range ecology journal. Hazel Drummond was named. The paper was titled Native Marginal Habitat Restoration and Soil Biology Recovery in Dryland Agricultural Systems, a 3-year case study in Edwards County, Kansas. It was dry language for something that was not a dry subject. What it said, in the plainest terms Hazel could find when she explained it to Winifred Pryor over coffee, was that leaving the edges of your fields alone, giving them back to what they wanted to be, and bringing the bees back to tell you how it was going, had rebuilt something in the soil that 40 years of management had slowly removed, and that the rebuilding, once started, was faster than anyone had predicted. In the spring of 1998, the Kansas State University Extension Office in Garden City co-sponsored a field day at the Drummond place. They advertised it through the county extension offices and the Farm Bureau newsletters, and a brief notice in the agricultural sections of 2 regional papers. 63 farmers came. They came from Edwards County, and from Clark County, and from Comanche and Kiowa counties, some driving an hour each way, parking their trucks along County Road 7, and walking in through the gate where Hazel was standing to meet them. She took them to the east draw first. She walked them through it slowly, the way her father had walked her through a field when she was small, stopping at each section to explain what she was seeing and why it mattered. She showed them the soil cores. She showed them the notebooks, all 4 of them, laid open, on a folding table. She had set up in the drawer with a plastic tablecloth, weighted at the corners, with rocks because of the wind. She showed them where the bluestem and bergamot had come back, and where it had spread since the first year. And what, that breading told her about the root systems beneath it. An older farmer from the south end of Clark County, a man who had been farming that ground since 1958, crouched at the edge of the draw and pressed his knuckles into the soil, and then walked to the fence line and pressed his knuckles into the unmanaged ditch on the other side. He stayed in that position for almost a minute, moving his knuckles slightly, as if reading something by touch. He stood up. "It's like comparing a sponge to a rock," he said. "Same ground," Hazel said. "Same county. Same rain." He looked at the draw. "Same rain," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "My grandfather thought the draws were the problem ground. Low, wet, always in the way. The dry years showed him otherwise," she said. He looked at her. "I've got 2 draws like this on the west side of my place," he said. "I've been meaning to tile drain them for 20 years. She told him what she would tell him instead, if he wanted to know. He said he did. She gave him Conrad's number and Agnes Rourke's number in Colorado, and the name of the beekeeping journal, and the title of the Prairie Ecology Manual from the Manhattan Extension Office. She wrote it on a page from the spiral notebook she had carried in her shirt pocket since 1991. He folded it and put it in his breast pocket. "I'm 64 years old," he said. He looked at the draw again, at the 14 species of native plants that had come back to ground that had been fence-line weeds 6 years ago. "Is it too late to start something like this?" Hazel looked at him steadily. "It took 6 years to get here," she said. "You may not see all of it, but the land will, and you'll see enough to know you were right to try." He put his cap back on and nodded once, and stood there in the draw for another moment with the Kansas wind moving the bergamot and the bluestem around his boots, the way that wind moves everything in that country. Without asking, without stopping, touching everything it passes through and continuing on. She stood beside him, looking at what she had made, which was not a miracle, and not a transformation, and not a story with a clean ending, but something better than all of those things. It was ground that had been listened to, carefully over years by a woman who had learned from her father that land does not reveal itself from the road. You see it by walking every inch of it. He had told her once, when she was young enough, that the grass was taller than she was. You see it by walking it until you know what it's saying. Hazel Drummond had walked it. She had written down what it said. She had kept the notebook, even when the notebook was the only thing she had to hold against the doubt. And in the summer of 1994, when the dry July came and the draws across Edwards County cracked and the fence-line weeds turned to straw, the ground along County Road 7 on the east side of the Drummond place stayed green a little longer than everything around it. Not forever. Just longer. That was enough.